Imagine standing in a museum, face to face with a reconstruction of a Neanderthal. The stooped, brutish figure stares back with vacant eyes. His heavy brow ridge casts shadows across a primitive face. His posture suggests something less than fully human, an evolutionary dead end. But what if everything you think you know about our closest evolutionary relatives is wrong? The sloped forehead, the hunched posture, the limited intelligence, these have become the accepted narrative of Neanderthals in our collective imagination. For over a century, we've relegated them to a lesser branch on our family tree. Yet beneath this popular conception lies a profound scientific mystery. What if Neanderthals were not the brutish cavemen we've imagined? What if they possessed minds as complex and capable as our own? Tonight, we explore the evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about our ancient cousins. The story begins with a simple fact. Neanderthals survived and thrived across Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years. That's more than 7 times longer than our own species has existed in our current form. It's a remarkable achievement for a species we've long dismissed as primitive failures. How could beings of limited cognition accomplish such a feat? The contradiction becomes even more striking when we examine recent discoveries. Advanced tools requiring complex planning, evidence of medical knowledge, burials suggesting ritual and symbolism, art that hints at abstract thought. These findings force us to confront an uncomfortable question. Have we systematically underestimated these ancient people? And if so, what does that reveal about our own biases and the stories we tell ourselves? Our journey tonight takes us through caves and archaeological sites spanning continents and hundreds of thousands of years. We'll examine fossilized remains and stone artifacts that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness. We'll see how early scientific prejudices shaped our view of Neanderthals, and how new evidence is forcing us to redraw the boundaries of what it means to be human. The implications extend far beyond archaeology. They touch on our very understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and what separates us from other beings. If Neanderthals were our cognitive equals, not primitive brutes but people with minds like our own, it transforms how we see ourselves. Perhaps most remarkably, we'll explore how their story becomes our story. The average person of European or Asian descent carries up to 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Concrete evidence that our ancestors didn't just meet Neanderthals. They had children with them. They became part of us. What does it mean when we realize that the others we once dismissed as subhuman are, in a very real sense, our direct ancestors? It's a story of prejudice and redemption spanning centuries. It begins with the first Neanderthal fossil discovered in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856. Continues through decades of scientific misinterpretation and leads to cutting-edge DNA analysis revealing truths long hidden in our bones. Our journey is also a cautionary tale about scientific certainty and human bias. We'll see how preconceptions can blind even brilliant minds, how theories become dogma, and how challenging established views requires extraordinary courage and evidence. Throughout history, we've repeatedly drawn lines separating us from them. Time and again, science has erased these boundaries. The Neanderthal story may be the most profound example yet, revealing how those we once considered fundamentally different were remarkably similar to ourselves. In telling this story, we're forced to confront difficult questions about human exceptionalism. What truly makes us human? Is it our biology, our behavior, our capacity for abstract thought? And if Neanderthals shared these qualities, what does that mean? Perhaps most importantly, we'll explore what Neanderthals can teach us about ourselves, our origins, our adaptability, and our future on this planet. Their extinction, occurring shortly after our ancestors' arrival in their territories, holds lessons we ignore at our peril. Tonight, we will journey back in time to meet our misunderstood relatives face to face. We'll see them not through the distorting lens of outdated science, but through the clear evidence of what they actually achieved and who they really were. So settle in as we unravel one of anthropology's greatest mysteries. Who were the Neanderthals really? And why have we been so wrong about them for so long? The answer will challenge everything you thought you knew about what makes us human. Chapter 2. The Burden of Misconception. The stakes of the Neanderthal question extend far beyond academic debate. Our understanding of these ancient people fundamentally shapes how we view ourselves and our place in the world. It influences our conception of human uniqueness and the very definition of humanity. For generations, we've placed ourselves on a pedestal, the crown of creation, fundamentally different from and superior to all other beings. Neanderthals occupied a problematic middle ground in this worldview, human enough to recognize but primitive enough to dismiss. This perspective provided a comfortable narrative, a linear progression from primitive ancestors to our supposedly superior modern form. Neanderthals became useful foils, what we once were, that thankfully evolved beyond. The brutish caveman became a measure of our progress. The image served political purposes too. In the 19th century, as Europeans colonized vast regions of the world, the concept of lesser human forms helped justify subjugation of indigenous peoples. Scientific racism found ammunition in this hierarchical view of human development. Even as science moved beyond these explicitly racist frameworks, the image of Neanderthals as cognitively limited persisted. It reinforced a comforting assumption that our species alone possessed the neural hardware for complex language, abstract thought, and creative problem-solving. But what if this foundational assumption is wrong? What if cognitive modernity, the capacity for symbolic thought, planning, empathy, and creativity, isn't exclusive to Homo sapiens? What if these capacities evolved much earlier and were shared by our evolutionary cousins? This possibility creates a profound philosophical challenge. If Neanderthals possessed minds essentially like our own, capable of art, symbolic thought, and complex social organization, then the qualities we consider uniquely human aren't actually unique to our species at all. It would mean that for thousands of years, while our ancestors spread across Africa and began venturing into Eurasia, another equally intelligent human species was building societies, creating tools, and developing cultures across Europe and Western Asia. This realization forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We may not be as special as we thought. Our cognitive abilities, rather than being a unique evolutionary leap, might instead be variations on neural frameworks that evolved in our common ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago. Even more challenging is what this means for our understanding of consciousness itself. If Neanderthals were essentially like us cognitively, then the human-like mind may have multiple evolutionary expressions rather than a single, unique emergence. The implications extend to ethics as well. If Neanderthals were our cognitive equals, their extinction becomes not just a biological event but something more morally complex, particularly if our ancestors played a role in their disappearance. We know Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlapped in Europe and the Middle East for thousands of years. If they were truly our equals in mind and capability, their ultimate disappearance raises difficult questions about competition, coexistence, and possibly conflict between human groups. This reframing also changes how we might think about the Neanderthal DNA many of us carry. Rather than representing some primitive genetic inheritance, these genes might instead be the legacy of a sophisticated people who contributed meaningfully to who we are today. Some Neanderthal genes appear to have been selectively retained because they were beneficial, helping our ancestors adapt to new environments as they spread beyond Africa. What once seemed like evolutionary contamination now appears more like valuable genetic diversity. Perhaps most significantly, recognizing Neanderthals as our cognitive equals requires confronting how scientific biases shape our understanding of the past. The original reconstruction of Neanderthals as stooped, brutish creatures wasn't based on complete fossil evidence. It reflected the preconceptions of early researchers who assumed Neanderthals must represent a more primitive form of humanity. This bias persisted for decades, despite mounting evidence that Neanderthals walked upright, just as we do, and had brain cases as large as our own. The story of our changing understanding reveals how science at its best can overcome initial biases through methodical gathering of evidence. Yet it also shows how resistant established narratives can be, even in the face of contradictory data. This resistance matters because the Neanderthal question isn't merely historical. It touches on contemporary debates about consciousness, the origins of language, and what cognitive abilities might exist in other species living alongside us today. If we've been wrong about Neanderthals for so long, might we also be underestimating the cognitive capacities of great apes, elephants, cetaceans, corvids, and other highly intelligent non-human animals? The parallel to our Neanderthal misconceptions is striking. The consequences of this reassessment extend even to how we might someday interact with artificial intelligence or extraterrestrial life. The Neanderthal story teaches us humility about recognizing intelligence that manifests differently from our own. But perhaps the most profound implication is more personal. If Neanderthals were essentially like us in mind and capability, yet physically distinct in certain ways, it expands our understanding of what it means to be human beyond the specific biological form we currently inhabit. In this sense, the Neanderthal question isn't just about the past. It's about our future. As technology increasingly allows us to modify our own biology, the boundaries of humanity will become increasingly fluid. The Neanderthal example provides historical precedent for this fluidity. Their story reminds us that humanity isn't defined by specific physical traits, but by patterns of cognition, social connection, and symbolic thought. As we move into an era where human capabilities and forms may diversify through technology, this broader definition becomes increasingly relevant. At stake is nothing less than our understanding of ourselves, not just who we were, but who we are and who we might become. If being human extends beyond our specific species to include other minds like our own, it fundamentally changes how we see our place in the natural world. Chapter 3. The Birth of a Misconception. The story begins on a summer day in 1856 in the Neander Valley near Düsseldorf, Germany. Limestone quarry workers discovered unusual bones in a cave, a skullcap with a prominent brow ridge, along with other skeletal fragments. They thought they'd found the remains of a bear, but these weren't bear bones. They were the first recognized fossils of what would eventually be named Homo neanderthalensis, a species named after the valley where they were found. The timing of this discovery would prove fateful for how these ancient people would be perceived. These fossils emerged just 3 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The scientific world was already wrestling with the implications of emerging evolutionary theory, and these strange human-like remains immediately became entangled in that controversy. The first scientific description came from anatomist Erman Schaffhausen, who recognized them as human but noted their exceptional and unusual development. From the beginning, the emphasis was on difference rather than similarity, on what separated these beings from us. German biologist Ernst Haeckel placed Neanderthals on a lower evolutionary rung, labeling them Homo stupidus, literally stupid man. This characterization, though quickly abandoned in formal classification, cast a long shadow over how Neanderthals would be perceived for generations. By the 1860s, more complete Neanderthal skeletons had been discovered in Belgium, and the scientific debates intensified. Were these abnormal humans? Primitive ancestors? Evidence against divine creation? The questions were as much philosophical as scientific. In 1863, biologist Thomas Henry Huxley took a more measured approach, suggesting these remains represented an ancient human form. But others, like anatomist Rudolf Virchow, dismissed them entirely, claiming the bones belonged to a modern human with rickets or arthritis. This debate unfolded within the broader intellectual context of the Victorian era, with its rigid hierarchical thinking. Europeans placed themselves at the pinnacle of humanity, with other races considered less evolved. Neanderthals easily fit into this ladder-like view of human development. The first influential reconstruction of a Neanderthal came from anatomist Marcellin Boule in the early 1900s. Based on remains from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, Boule depicted a stooped, bent-kneed creature with a forward-jutting head, more ape than human. This image burned itself into the public consciousness and scientific understanding alike. But it contained a critical error. The skeleton Boule studied had severe arthritis, explaining the stooped posture. The damage was done, however. The brutish Neanderthal became scientific orthodoxy. Hollywood and popular culture embraced this primitive characterization. Early films depicted Neanderthals as club-wielding brutes, barely able to speak. The term Neanderthal entered everyday language as an insult, synonymous with backward thinking and brutish behavior. This cultural portrayal reinforced scientific bias in a circular pattern. Scientists influenced by cultural stereotypes continued interpreting evidence through this distorted lens. Each new discovery was fitted into the established narrative of Neanderthal primitivity. The misconception was further cemented by the discovery of more gracile early human fossils that seemed to fit better with our image of ourselves. In particular, the 1912 discovery of Piltdown Man, supposedly an ancient human with a large brain but ape-like jaw, reinforced the narrative. Piltdown Man would later be exposed as one of history's greatest scientific frauds, a modern human skull combined with an orangutan jaw. But for decades, it pushed Neanderthals further to the margins, cementing their status as an evolutionary side branch. Even after Piltdown was debunked in 1953, the image of Neanderthals as cognitively limited persisted. The emerging replacement theory held that our species, Homo sapiens, had simply outcompeted Neanderthals because we were smarter, more innovative, and more adaptable. This narrative satisfied our desire for evolutionary superiority. It explained why we survived and spread across the planet while Neanderthals disappeared. It placed us at the culmination of a long evolutionary march toward greater intelligence and capability. But in science, evidence eventually overcomes bias, at least in theory. And beginning in the mid-20th century, evidence began mounting that challenged this simplistic view. New fossil discoveries and archaeological findings started filling in a more complex picture. A key moment came in 1957 when anatomists William Strauss and A.J. Cave re-examined the La Chapelle Neanderthal skeleton. They concluded that, accounting for pathological conditions, this individual would have walked erectly and had a posture quite similar to ours. Their paper famously noted that if this Neanderthal could be reincarnated and placed in a New York subway, provided that he were bathed, shaved, and dressed in modern clothing, it is doubtful whether he would attract any more attention than some of its other denizens. This reassessment began a slow but steady re-evaluation of Neanderthal capabilities. Archaeological discoveries revealed increasingly sophisticated tools, suggesting cognitive abilities far beyond what had been assumed. But old paradigms die hard in science. The real revolution would come decades later, with advances in both archaeology and genetics. But before examining those discoveries, we need to understand the physical world Neanderthals inhabited, a harsh, demanding environment that shaped their bodies and likely their minds. Neanderthals evolved during the Middle Pleistocene, diverging from our common ancestor approximately 700,000 to 500,000 years ago. While our ancestors continued evolving in Africa, Neanderthals adapted to the harsher conditions of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. These different environments led to different physical adaptations. Neanderthals developed stockier bodies with shorter limbs, an adaptation to cold climates that minimizes heat loss. Their barrel-shaped chests and robust builds reflected lives of intense physical activity. They had larger brains than modern humans on average, about 1,600 cubic centimeters compared to our 1,400. These larger brains likely supported enhanced visual processing and body control needed for hunting in challenging terrains and variable lighting conditions. Their world was one of extreme climate fluctuations, glacial periods of intense cold, alternating with warmer interglacials. They survived through multiple ice ages, adapting their behaviors and technologies to changing conditions over hundreds of thousands of years. Picture a typical Neanderthal day, waking in a cave shelter as dawn breaks over a tundra-like landscape, planning the day's hunt with a small band of kin, preparing tools, tracking prey across unfamiliar terrain, coordinating a dangerous close-quarters attack on a large mammal. This harsh environment required sophisticated cognitive abilities, planning, communication, tool preparation, environmental knowledge, and social cooperation. The notion that such demands could be met by beings of limited intelligence increasingly strained credibility. And yet, the image of the cognitively limited Neanderthal persisted well into the late 20th century. It would take revolutionary new methods and discoveries to finally begin dismantling this deeply entrenched misconception. Chapter 4. The Evidence Mounts. The first serious challenge to the traditional view came from archaeological sites across Europe. At Abric-Romani in Spain, researchers discovered carefully arranged living spaces with designated areas for specific activities, evidence of organized thinking and social structure. At sites like Grotte du Renne in France, they found bone tools requiring complex manufacturing techniques and even jewelry made from animal teeth. These weren't the products of mindless creatures, but of beings who understood symbolism and aesthetic value. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery of what appeared to be a flute made from a cave bear's femur at Divje Babe in Slovenia, dating to approximately 43,000 years ago. This find suggested Neanderthals not only created music, but had developed sophisticated technology to do so. Though some researchers questioned whether the holes in this bone were human-made rather than the result of carnivore activity, the possibility of Neanderthal music opened new questions about their cognitive and creative capacities. More evidence emerged at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, where a Neanderthal had been carefully placed in what appeared to be a deliberate burial. The body lay in a fetal position in a shallow pit, suggesting ritual behavior and perhaps concern for an afterlife. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, excavators found a Neanderthal skeleton with pollen clusters, suggesting flowers had been placed with the body. Though later contested, this finding raised the possibility of funeral rituals, behaviors, requiring abstract thinking about death and symbolic meaning. The tools Neanderthals created also contradicted the primitive stereotype. Their distinctive Mousterian technology included finely crafted stone implements, requiring considerable skill and forethought to manufacture, with specialized tools for different purposes. They practiced what archaeologists call prepared core technique, mentally visualizing the final tool within a stone before beginning to work it. This requires abstract thinking, planning, and spatial reasoning, all supposedly hallmarks of modern human cognition. At sites like Nigso in Germany, researchers found evidence of adhesives made from birch bark pitch, a complex process requiring careful temperature control and multiple steps. Creating these adhesives demanded sophisticated technical knowledge and planning ability. Microscopic analysis of Neanderthal tools revealed traces of wood, revealing they crafted implements that simply hadn't survived in the archaeological record. Their technology was far more diverse than previously thought, including wooden spears hardened with fire. At Bruniquel Cave in France, archaeologists discovered a truly extraordinary sight: carefully arranged stalagmite circles deep within the cave, dating to around 176,500 years ago. These structures, far from any natural light, required planning, coordination, and artificial illumination to create. The purpose of these structures remains unknown, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps practical, but their existence demonstrates capabilities far beyond what had been attributed to Neanderthals. Someone had ventured deep into darkness with purpose and vision. The evidence for Neanderthal fire use became increasingly compelling. Not only did they maintain fires, but they appeared to use them strategically for warmth, protection, cooking, and tool production. Control of fire requires abstract thinking and technical understanding. Fire use also has profound implications for social organization, creating a central gathering place that facilitates communication and cultural transmission. The hearth becomes a focus for storytelling, teaching, and reinforcing group bonds, all foundations of complex culture. Analysis of Neanderthal teeth revealed surprising dietary sophistication. While they certainly hunted large game, they also consumed a variety of plant foods, including cooked grains. This diverse diet required extensive environmental knowledge and food processing techniques. Chemical analysis of dental calculus, mineralized plaque from Neanderthal teeth at El Cedrón Cave in Spain, revealed evidence of medicinal plant use. They appeared to be selecting plants with pain-relieving and antibiotic properties, suggesting knowledge of natural remedies. At the same site, researchers found evidence of right-handedness in 10 of 13 individuals based on tooth-scratching patterns. This population level-handedness is significant. It's associated with brain lateralization, a trait previously thought unique to modern humans. The ability to recover from serious injuries provided another window into Neanderthal social life. Many fossils show healed fractures and wounds that would have required long-term care from group members, evidence of compassion and social support systems. A particularly striking example came from Shanadar Cave, where one individual had survived multiple serious injuries, including a withered arm and blindness in one eye. His survival into his 40s would have been impossible without substantial assistance from his community. These findings painted a picture of Neanderthal life far removed from the nasty, brutish, and short existence once imagined. They suggested beings with strong social bonds, technical knowledge, environmental adaptation, and perhaps even symbolic thinking. But the most revolutionary evidence came from an entirely unexpected direction: genetics. When researchers first sequenced fragments of Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA in 1997, they opened a new window into our relationship with these ancient cousins. The initial findings suggested Neanderthals were a distinct species that had split from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years earlier. This seemed to reinforce the traditional view of Neanderthals as fundamentally different from us. But the real breakthrough came in 2010, when an international team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. The results were stunning and forced a fundamental reconsideration of the human-Neanderthal relationship. The genomic data revealed that all non-African humans carry Neanderthal DNA, typically 1 to 2% of their genome. This could only mean one thing. Our ancestors had not just met Neanderthals. They had children with them who survived and passed on their genes. This finding demolished the strict species barrier that had been assumed between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Successful interbreeding meant we were much more closely related than previously thought. Not separate species, but perhaps subspecies capable of producing fertile offspring. Even more remarkably, genetic analysis suggested that some Neanderthal genes had been positively selected in human populations, meaning they provided adaptive advantages. Far from being evolutionary deadweight, Neanderthal DNA improved our ancestors' chances of survival. These beneficial genes included variants affecting our immune system, skin and hair characteristics, and potentially even brain development. The implications were profound. We hadn't simply replaced Neanderthals. We had incorporated aspects of them into ourselves. As genetic analysis techniques improved, researchers identified specific Neanderthal genes still active in modern humans. Some affect how our immune systems respond to infections, while others influence skin color, hair characteristics, and even aspects of brain function. The picture emerging from genetics complemented the archaeological evidence. Neanderthals were sophisticated beings whose legacy continues in our own bodies. The strict boundary between them and us dissolved with each new discovery. But the most dramatic challenge to traditional views came from evidence of Neanderthal symbolic behavior. The capacity for abstract thought long considered the exclusive domain of our species. And nowhere was this evidence more striking than in their apparent artistic expressions. In 2018, researchers published findings that stunned the archaeological world. Cave paintings in Spain had been dated to more than 65,000 years ago, at least 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe. The only possible artists were Neanderthals. These weren't just random marks. The caves contained hand stencils, geometric patterns, and abstract symbols, all hallmarks of symbolic thought. If the dating was correct, Neanderthals had invented cave painting long before our ancestors reached Europe. Similarly, shells with traces of pigment found at sites in Spain dated to around 115,000 years ago, far too early for modern human presence. These appeared to be containers for mixing colors, suggesting Neanderthals used pigments for body decoration or other symbolic purposes. At Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, researchers discovered what appeared to be an intentional geometric engraving made by Neanderthals. The cross-hatch pattern required deliberate, repeated actions with no apparent practical purpose, the very definition of symbolic behavior. Chapter 5. When the story falls apart. The evidence challenging the primitive Neanderthal narrative continued to mount with each new discovery. As researchers applied cutting-edge technology to re-examine old fossils and archaeological sites, the contradictions in the established view became increasingly difficult to ignore. Perhaps the most fundamental misconception concerned Neanderthal anatomy itself. For decades, textbooks depicted them with forward-thrust heads and bent knees, a stance more simian than human. Yet this image was based on a single elderly arthritic individual. Modern analyses of Neanderthal skeletons reveal they stood fully upright, just as we do. Their distinctive anatomical features, robust bones, shorter limbs, barrel chests, weren't primitive traits, but specialized adaptations to the cold environments they inhabited. Their brains tell an equally compelling story. While shaped differently from ours, longer and lower rather than high and rounded, Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average than modern human brains. Size alone doesn't determine cognitive capacity, but this contradicted the primitive brain narrative. Brain scans of Neanderthal skulls show they had proportionally large parietal lobes, regions associated with spatial awareness, tool use, and sensory integration. Their frontal lobes, linked to planning and social behavior, were comparable to our own. Perhaps most striking is their endocranial imprints, marks left by the brain on the inner skull. These suggest a brain organization remarkably similar to our own, with developed regions for language processing, including an expanded Broca's area associated with speech production. This brings us to another persistent myth: that Neanderthals lacked the anatomical capability for complex speech. Early reconstructions suggested their larynx position prevented the range of sounds needed for complex language, a hypothesis that became widely accepted. But in 1983, a Neanderthal hyoid bone, crucial for speech production, was discovered at Kebara Cave in Israel. Indistinguishable from a modern human hyoid, this tiny bone contradicted decades of speculation about Neanderthal vocal limitations. Further research revealed Neanderthals possessed the same version of the FOXP2 gene as modern humans, often called the language gene, because mutations cause severe speech disorders. This genetic evidence suggested they had the neural wiring for language. Computer reconstructions of their vocal tract, based on anatomical evidence, indicate Neanderthals could produce all the vowel sounds found in human languages, though with slightly different consonant capabilities. They could certainly speak, even if their speech sounded somewhat different from ours. The implications are profound. If Neanderthals possessed language, not just communication but true symbolic language, it means they could share complex information, transmit knowledge across generations, coordinate sophisticated actions, and perhaps even tell stories. Language opens the door to culture, shared knowledge, beliefs, and practices that extend beyond what an individual can discover in a single lifetime. The evidence increasingly suggests Neanderthals had exactly this kind of cultural transmission. Their technological consistency across vast regions and time periods indicates knowledge passing from generation to generation. The Mousterian tool tradition persisted with remarkable stability for over 100,000 years, evidence of effective cultural transmission. Yet within this tradition, we see regional variations and innovations, what archaeologists call cultural provinces. Different Neanderthal groups developed slightly different techniques and tool types, suggesting cultural diversity rather than mindless replication. Technological innovation becomes even more apparent in late Neanderthal sites. The Chateauperonian industry in France shows blade technology and bone tools once thought exclusive to modern humans. Were these copied from encountering Homo sapiens or independent innovations? The evidence increasingly suggests the latter. Recent dating places some Chateauperonian sites earlier than modern human arrival in the region. Neanderthals appeared to have independently developed these advanced technologies, contradicting the narrative of their cognitive limitations. Their use of materials beyond stone also challenges traditional views. Evidence from multiple sites shows Neanderthals worked with wood, bone, pitch, and plant fibers, materials requiring different techniques and knowledge than stoneworking. At Abri-du-Marais in France, researchers discovered cord fragments on stone tools dating to 50,000 years ago. Evidence: Neanderthals created twisted fibers, a technology requiring understanding of multiple components working together. They may have made nets, bags, or clothing. Fire use presents another contradiction to the primitive narrative. Far from merely opportunistically using natural fires, Neanderthals mastered controlled fire production. Chemical analysis at sites like Les Canalettes in France shows they repeatedly made fires in the same locations. They didn't just maintain fire, they used it strategically. Evidence suggests they employed different wood types for different purposes, created hearth structures, and used fire in tool production. This demonstrates planning ability and technical knowledge. Their relationship with fire extends to cooking. Analysis of dental calculus reveals they cooked plant foods, potentially including grains. This contradicts the simplistic view of Neanderthals as exclusively meat eaters and suggests nutritional knowledge. Dietary studies reveal remarkable breadth. They consumed large game, small animals, fish, shellfish, plants, nuts, and seeds. This dietary flexibility required diverse knowledge and techniques, contradicting the image of inflexible, specialized hunters. The coastal site of Figueira Brava in Portugal revealed Neanderthals collected shellfish and caught dolphins and seals, suggesting marine resource exploitation previously thought beyond their capabilities. They understood tides and seasonal resource availability. Evidence from El Sidran in Spain and Spa in Belgium indicates Neanderthals also used plants medicinally. Chemical analysis of dental calculus found traces of poplar, containing salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and penicillium mold, suggesting knowledge of pain relief and infection treatment. Their apparent understanding of medicinal plants corresponds with archaeological evidence of care for injured and elderly community members. Many Neanderthal fossils show healed injuries that would have required extended care and support from others. This social care extended to specialized knowledge. The Altamura Neanderthal in Italy shows dental wear suggesting the use of toothpicks to relieve gum pain. Others show evidence of dentistry, deliberate manipulation of painful teeth using tools. Such behaviors require not just technical knowledge, but empathy, the ability to recognize another's suffering and act to alleviate it. This fundamental capacity for empathy directly contradicts the classic image of Neanderthals as brutish and self-centered. Burial practices provide perhaps the most striking contradiction to the primitive narrative. While debates continue about whether all apparent Neanderthal burials were intentional, several sites show clear evidence of deliberate, careful interment of the dead. At La Ferracie in France, multiple Neanderthal burials were discovered, including children placed in carefully prepared pits. Such treatment suggests emotional attachment and concern for the dead that extends beyond practical considerations. The question of Neanderthal spirituality remains open, but their burial behaviors suggest at minimum a special treatment of the dead that differs from practical disposal. This hints at conceptual thinking about death and perhaps an afterlife. All these contradictions to the traditional narrative lead to an uncomfortable question. If the evidence for Neanderthal cognitive sophistication is so substantial, why did the primitive stereotype persist for so long in both scientific and popular understanding? The answer lies partly in the history of paleoanthropology itself. Early researchers approached Neanderthal fossils with preconceptions about human evolution as a linear march toward modernity, with our species at the pinnacle. Neanderthals had to be primitive by definition. This circular reasoning persisted through generations of researchers. Evidence that fit the primitive narrative was emphasized. Contradictory findings were explained away or marginalized. The power of an established paradigm to shape interpretation cannot be underestimated. Beyond scientific bias lies something more fundamental: our psychological need to see ourselves as unique. The primitive Neanderthal served as a convenient contrast that highlighted our supposed uniqueness and superiority. We needed them to be different. Chapter 6: The Myths We Created. Perhaps the most persistent myth about Neanderthals is that they were evolutionary failures, a species that couldn't adapt to changing conditions and competition from our supposedly superior ancestors. This narrative satisfies our desire for a tidy evolutionary story with ourselves as the inevitable victors. But this myth collapses under scrutiny. Neanderthals successfully inhabited Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years, surviving multiple ice ages and dramatic environmental shifts. They thrived in some of the most challenging conditions our planet has offered. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed in our current form for perhaps 200,000 years, and only expanded beyond Africa around 60,000 years ago. From this perspective, Neanderthals were remarkably successful, lasting far longer than our global presence thus far. Their extinction, approximately 40,000 years ago, coincided with several factors: climate change, the arrival of modern humans in their territories, and possibly diseases to which they had no immunity. Their disappearance wasn't inevitable, but contingent on specific historical circumstances. Another persistent myth portrays Neanderthals as exclusively cave-dwelling creatures, perpetually sheltering from a hostile world. Popular media continues to call them cavemen, reinforcing this image of primitive beings huddled in darkness. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. While Neanderthals certainly used caves as shelters, as did early Homo sapiens, they also built open-air structures. At Moldova in Ukraine, researchers found remains of a dwelling built from mammoth bones, showing architectural planning. At sites like Les Folies in France and Indenaldorf in Germany, archaeologists discovered post holes and artificially leveled surfaces suggesting constructed shelters. Neanderthals didn't just find homes, they created them according to their needs. Their habitat range further contradicts the cave-dwelling stereotype. Neanderthal sites span from Wales to Siberia, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. they occupied mountains, plains, forests, and coasts, adapting their lifestyles to diverse environments. The myth of Neanderthals as solitary hunters or small, isolated bands also persists in popular imagination. This image fits with the primitive narrative. Beings too socially limited to form complex communities, living hand-to-mouth in perpetual struggle. Archaeological evidence suggests much larger social networks. Raw materials in Neanderthal sites often originated hundreds of kilometers away, indicating trade or movement across large territories. Similar tool styles across vast regions suggest information sharing between groups. Recent excavations at La Côte de Saint-Brelade in Jersey revealed evidence of seasonal aggregations, large gatherings where multiple Neanderthal groups came together, perhaps for social purposes beyond immediate survival needs. These weren't isolated bands but interconnected communities. Perhaps most telling is the genetic evidence. The DNA analysis of 12 Neanderthals from Spain's El Sidrón cave shows they were closely related, likely an extended family group. But broader genetic studies show Neanderthals maintained genetic diversity despite their relatively small population. This genetic management required sophisticated social systems connecting different bands, allowing mate exchange while avoiding inbreeding. Far from being socially primitive, Neanderthals maintained complex population structures across vast territories for hundreds of thousands of years. Another pervasive myth portrays Neanderthals as fundamentally non-artistic, incapable of symbolic expression or aesthetic appreciation. This supposed lack of symbolic capacity has long been cited as the crucial difference between them and us. Yet evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior continues to accumulate. Beyond the cave paintings in Spain and the geometric engravings in Gibraltar, researchers have found numerous examples of what appears to be aesthetic and symbolic activity. At multiple sites across Europe, archaeologists have discovered pigments like red ochre, showing signs of processing and use. These colored materials had no immediate practical purpose. Their value was symbolic, perhaps for body decoration or marking objects. Eagle talons found at Krapina in Croatia show cut marks indicating they were removed from the birds and potentially worn as jewelry 120,000 years ago, long before modern human arrival in Europe. Similar finds at other sites suggest this was a widespread practice. At Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, researchers found feathers from birds with no food value but striking black plumage, suggesting Neanderthals collected them for their visual properties. This indicates aesthetic appreciation, valuing objects for appearance rather than function. Perhaps most striking are shells with natural holes that show wear patterns suggesting they were strung together, found at sites across Europe. Some even contain traces of pigment. These personal ornaments directly contradict the myth of a non-symbolic Neanderthal mind. The myth of Neanderthal cognitive inferiority often focuses on their supposedly limited innovation, characterized as making the same tools in the same way for millennia, unlike our supposedly more inventive species. This perception stems partly from archaeological visibility. Stone tools preserve while other technologies largely vanish. But even within their lithic traditions, Neanderthals showed considerable innovation and adaptation to specific needs and environments. Their primary tool-making approach, the level-walk technique, required sophisticated planning and spatial visualization. The knapper had to prepare a core meticulously to remove a single, perfectly formed flake, a process requiring abstract thinking and fine motor control. Rather than indicating cognitive limitation, the stability of Neanderthal technology over long periods suggests effective knowledge transmission across generations. They weren't failing to innovate. They were successfully preserving and teaching complex technical knowledge. When environmental conditions changed significantly, Neanderthal technology did adapt. Late Neanderthal industries, like the Chattelperronian, show clear technological shifts. incorporating blade production techniques and bone tool manufacturing previously thought exclusive to modern humans. The myth of Neanderthal technological stagnation also ignores their mastery of composite technology, combining different materials to create more effective tools. Evidence shows they hafted stone points to wooden shafts using carefully produced adhesives. Creating these adhesives required multi-stage production processes, including carefully controlled heating of birch bark to extract pitch. Experiments show this demands sophisticated temperature control and planning, far from the simple technology they're often credited with. Perhaps the most scientifically untenable myth is that Neanderthals couldn't speak. This idea persisted for decades based on speculative reconstructions of their vocal anatomy and assumptions about their cognitive limitations. As we've seen, both anatomical and genetic evidence contradicts this. Their hyoid bones, FOXP2 gene, and endocranial imprints all suggest capabilities for complex vocalization and language processing similar to our own. More recent research has examined the ear structures of Neanderthals, finding they were tuned to the same frequency ranges as modern human speech. Their hearing was specialized for vocal communication in exactly the same way ours is. The myth of speechless Neanderthals served an important purpose in maintaining the narrative of human uniqueness. If they couldn't speak, they couldn't share complex ideas, create oral traditions, or develop the cultural frameworks that define human societies. But all available evidence suggests they could indeed speak, and this opens the possibility they had rich oral cultures, shared stories, passed down traditional knowledge, and maintained complex social rules through language, just as human societies do worldwide. The persistence of these myths, despite mounting contradictory evidence, reveals something important about human psychology. We seem deeply invested in maintaining the boundary between us and them, even when that boundary increasingly appears to be an illusion. When we examine these myths critically, a pattern emerges. Each served to maintain a comfortable distance between ourselves and Neanderthals, to preserve our sense of uniqueness and superiority, even as the scientific evidence increasingly connected us to these ancient relatives. The ultimate myth may be the most foundational. The Neanderthals represent a separate, failed branch of humanity, while we represent the main trunk of human evolution. Genetics has definitively disproven this narrative. The discovery that many modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA means their story is literally written in our bodies. They are not separate from us, but part of us. Their legacy continues in the genes of billions of people alive today. As paleogeneticist Johannes Krause put it, we are the ones who are partially Neanderthal. This biological reality forces us to reconsider not just who they were, but who we are, a hybrid species carrying the genetic heritage of multiple human lineages. Chapter 7. The Mirror in the Past. As the evidence mounting in favor of Neanderthal cognitive complexity becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, we must confront a profound question. What does it mean if we weren't the only human-like minds on Earth until very recently? The stakes of this question extend far beyond academic debates about human evolution. They touch on our fundamental understanding of ourselves, our place in nature, and what it means to be human. The Neanderthal question becomes, at its core, a question about us. If Neanderthals possessed minds essentially like our own, capable of language, symbolism, social complexity, technical innovation, and aesthetic appreciation, then what we call humanity isn't unique to our species. It evolved earlier and appeared in multiple forms. This realization forces a radical reconsideration of human uniqueness. The qualities we've long considered exclusive to Homo sapiens, the supposed hallmarks that separate us from all other life on Earth, may have been shared by our evolutionary cousins. Consider the implications. For hundreds of thousands of years, while our ancestors were developing in Africa, another form of humanity with minds like ours was creating societies across Europe and Western Asia. we were not alone in our cognitive uniqueness. When our ancestors finally expanded out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals around 50,000 years ago, they weren't meeting primitive creatures but fellow human beings, different in body but perhaps remarkably similar in mind and capability. This meeting of different human forms wasn't just a momentary overlap of population ranges. Genetic evidence shows it led to intimate contact and offspring. Those children and their descendants carried genes from both lineages, a literal blending of different human forms. The evidence for interbreeding requires us to reconsider what it means to be a species. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens could produce fertile offspring, were we truly separate species or rather variants of the same humankind? The boundaries blur upon close examination. This blurring of boundaries extends beyond biology to psychology. If Neanderthals thought symbolically, created art, buried their dead, and used language, then the mental world we inhabit, the human way of experiencing reality, isn't exclusive to our lineage. The implications ripple outward. If human-like consciousness evolved multiple times or expressed itself in multiple forms, what does this suggest about consciousness itself? Is the particular form of awareness we experience an inevitable outcome of complex brains? This question connects directly to ongoing debates about animal consciousness. If Neanderthals, beings with differently structured brains, possessed minds similar to our own, might other species with large complex brains also experience forms of consciousness more similar to ours than we've assumed? Great apes, elephants, cetaceans, and certain birds display behaviors suggesting complex thought, tool use, self-recognition, apparent mourning of dead companions, and problem-solving. The Neanderthal example suggests we should perhaps be less quick to dismiss these as merely instinctual. The stakes extend even further when we consider artificial intelligence. As we create increasingly sophisticated AI systems, questions about the nature and recognition of consciousness become not just philosophical but practical. The Neanderthal case offers a sobering lesson. For over a century, we systematically underestimated the cognitive capacities of our closest relatives despite mounting evidence. Our biases and need for human uniqueness blinded us to the reality of who Neanderthals were. Might similar biases affect how we recognize other forms of intelligence? The Neanderthal question also forces us to confront the contingency of our own existence. Their extinction wasn't inevitable. Had circumstances been slightly different, they might have survived, and we might not be here to ponder these questions. This contingency challenges teleological views of human evolution. The notion that our emergence was somehow destined or represents the pinnacle of evolutionary development. The fossil record shows multiple human species existing simultaneously, each adapted to different circumstances. Neanderthal extinction also raises uncomfortable questions about our own species' role in their disappearance. While climate change certainly played a part, the timing of their decline coincides with our ancestors' arrival in their territories. Whether through direct competition, conflict, or introduction of new diseases, our species may have contributed to their extinction. If they were our cognitive equals, this wasn't simply natural selection, but potentially the first human-caused extinction of another human-like consciousness. This possibility casts a shadow over our species, history, and raises ethical questions about our relationship with other forms of intelligence. If we fail to recognize and respect the humanity of beings so similar to ourselves, what does this suggest about our capacity to recognize other forms of intelligence? As we face potential encounters with artificial intelligence or even extraterrestrial life in the future, the Neanderthal story offers a cautionary tale. Our tendency to draw sharp boundaries between us and them may blind us to profound similarities and shared capacities. The stakes become personal when we recognize that many of us carry Neanderthal DNA. Recent research has identified specific Neanderthal genes affecting everything from our immune responses to sleep patterns, pain sensitivity, mood disorders, and even risk factors for depression. Some Neanderthal genes appear beneficial, improving immune function against certain pathogens or helping our ancestors adapt to non-African environments. Others may contribute to certain health conditions. Their legacy lives within us in complex ways. This biological reality transforms how we should view Neanderthals. They aren't distant evolutionary cousins, but direct ancestors for many people alive today. Their story is our story. Their genes continue to shape our bodies and potentially our minds. The realization that we carry Neanderthal genes forces us to confront the artificiality of the boundaries we've drawn. The otherness we projected onto Neanderthals exists partly within ourselves. We've been defining against a portion of our own heritage. This has implications for how we think about human variation more broadly. If different human forms interbred in the past, not just Neanderthals but also Denisovans and potentially other archaic humans, then diversity has always been fundamental to our lineage. Rather than a single human type with variations, we might better understand humanity as a rich tapestry of interconnected lineages that have periodically separated and recombined throughout evolutionary history. Diversity isn't peripheral to human identity, but central to it. The stakes escalate further when we consider future human evolution. As genetic technologies advance, we gain the capacity to potentially alter our own genome. The Neanderthal example suggests human genetic diversity may be more fluid than we typically imagine. If different human forms existed in the past and contributed to our current genetic makeup, how might we conceptualize potential future variations in human form and cognition? The Neanderthal case suggests we should be wary of drawing rigid boundaries around humanness. As we face unprecedented global challenges, climate change, technological disruption, social transformation, the Neanderthal story offers both warning and hope. Warning in their ultimate extinction. Hope in their remarkable resilience over hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals survived multiple ice ages, adapted to dramatic environmental shifts, and maintained cultural continuity across vast time periods. Their adaptability in the face of harsh conditions may hold lessons for our own species as we navigate an uncertain future. The ultimate stake in the Neanderthal question may be our self-understanding. If we've been fundamentally wrong about our closest relatives, systematically underestimating their capabilities due to our biases, what other misconceptions might be shaping our view of ourselves? The growing evidence suggests Neanderthals weren't less than us, but simply different, another expression of the human potential. Their cognitive world wasn't primitive, but paralleled our own in complexity, while adapting to different environmental demands. This parallel development of complex cognition suggests something profound about intelligence itself. Rather than a single linear path toward greater complexity, intelligence may take multiple forms, each shaped by specific environmental and social contexts. Our recognition of Neanderthals as cognitive equals comes precisely when we face existential questions about our relationship with the planet and other forms of intelligence. The timing may not be coincidental. As we grapple with our place in nature, we're reassessing our evolutionary story. If Neanderthals were fundamentally like us in mind, if they created art, spoke languages, cared for their ill, buried their dead, and taught their children, then the essence of humanity transcends the specific biological form of Homo sapiens. What makes us human, in this view, isn't our particular skeletal structure or genetic sequence, but capacities for symbolic thought, cultural transmission, social cooperation, and perhaps most fundamentally, the ability to see ourselves in others unlike us. The final irony may be that in recognizing the humanity of Neanderthals, beings physically different but mentally similar, we may discover something essential about ourselves. The capacity to extend our circle of moral concern beyond those who look like us may define our humanity more than any fossil or gene. As we continue exploring the evidence, one question grows increasingly urgent. If Neanderthals were our cognitive equals, why did they disappear while we survived? And what might their fate reveal about our own future on this planet? Chapter 8. The Fate of Our Cousins. As we approach the central mystery of the Neanderthal story, we face the most profound question of all. If Neanderthals were our cognitive equals, beings with minds like our own, why did they disappear while we flourished? Their extinction around 40,000 years ago demands explanation. This question has generated intense scientific debate, with multiple competing theories. The traditional explanation, that Neanderthals were simply outcompeted by our cognitively superior ancestors, becomes untenable if they possessed minds comparable to our own. The leading theories can be grouped into three main categories: climate change, demographic factors, and interaction with Homo sapiens. Each has supporting evidence, and the truth likely involves elements of all three. Let's examine them in turn. The climate theory points to the severe environmental fluctuations of the late Pleistocene. Around 40,000 years ago, Europe experienced rapid climate oscillations, periods of extreme cold, followed by brief warming. These changes dramatically altered the ecosystems Neanderthals depended on. Neanderthal physiology was highly adapted to cold conditions, with stocky builds that conserved heat. But these rapid fluctuations would have repeatedly disrupted plant and animal communities, potentially stressing Neanderthal populations beyond their ability to adapt. Pollen records from this period show dramatic vegetation changes across Europe, with forests rapidly giving way to tundra and then returning again. Large herbivores that Neanderthals hunted would have shifted their ranges or declined, disrupting established hunting patterns. Evidence for this theory comes from the pattern of Neanderthal disappearance. They vanished first from northern Europe around 45,000 years ago, persisting longer in southern refuges like the Iberian Peninsula, exactly the pattern we would expect if climate were the primary driver. However, climate change alone presents a puzzle. Neanderthals had successfully weathered previous climate shifts, including several major glacial cycles. Why would these particular fluctuations prove fatal when they had adapted to similar changes over hundreds of thousands of years? This brings us to the second major theory: demographic factors. Neanderthals always existed in relatively small, scattered populations. Genetic studies suggest their total population across Europe and Western Asia may never have exceeded 70,000 individuals. Such small populations are inherently vulnerable to extinction. Minor fluctuations in birth and death rates can have outsized impacts. Disease outbreaks, local resource failures, or natural disasters could eliminate entire communities with limited potential for recovery. Genetic evidence supports this vulnerability. Analysis of Neanderthal genomes reveals remarkably low genetic diversity, far lower than found in modern human populations. This suggests they had already experienced population bottlenecks before their final disappearance. This limited genetic diversity would have made them more vulnerable to diseases and reduced their ability to adapt to changing conditions. Small, isolated populations also face increased risks of inbreeding, potentially reducing overall health and fertility over generations. Computer modeling suggests that even minor demographic pressures, slightly lower fertility rates, or higher childhood mortality could have led to extinction over time without requiring any catastrophic event. Neanderthal populations may have been slowly declining for thousands of years, but the timing of their final disappearance coincides with the arrival of our ancestors in Europe, raising the obvious question: what role did Homo sapiens play in the Neanderthal extinction? This brings us to the third major theory. The interaction theory proposes that competition with or direct conflict against Homo sapiens contributed significantly to Neanderthal decline. As our ancestors expanded into Europe around 45,000 years ago, they would have competed for the same resources Neanderthals relied upon. Early Homo sapiens brought different technologies, including more specialized hunting tools, tailored clothing, and possibly more effective social organization. Even small competitive advantages could have had significant impacts over generations in contested territories. The archaeological record shows Neanderthals and Homo sapiens occupied the same regions for several thousand years. In some areas, they appear to have alternated using the same caves, suggesting they competed for the same preferred habitats. While direct evidence of violent conflict between the species remains scarce, competition need not have been violent to be effective. Simply outcompeting for key resources or occupying preferred territories could have pushed Neanderthal populations into marginal habitats. Disease transmission presents another possibility. When previously isolated populations come into contact, they often exchange pathogens to which one group lacks immunity. Our ancestors may have inadvertently introduced diseases that devastated Neanderthal communities. This pattern of disease-driven population collapse has occurred repeatedly in recent human history when isolated populations encountered newcomers. Neanderthals' limited genetic diversity would have made them particularly vulnerable to novel pathogens. Interbreeding complicates this picture further. Genetic evidence confirms Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred, producing fertile offspring. This suggests relationships between the groups were not universally hostile and included intimate contact. Some researchers propose a more subtle form of absorption rather than replacement. As the more numerous Homo sapiens expanded into Europe, Neanderthals may have been gradually absorbed into their populations through interbreeding. Mathematical models suggest that even with minimal interbreeding rates, a larger population will genetically absorb a smaller one over time. The disappearance of distinctive Neanderthal features might reflect this genetic dilution rather than physical extinction. This absorption model finds support in the genetic record. Many modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA, but distinctively, Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA, which passes only through the maternal line, has not been found in modern populations. This pattern suggests most interbreeding involved Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females, potentially reflecting social dynamics where Neanderthal communities were incorporated into larger Homo sapiens groups, with gradual genetic and cultural assimilation. A final theory combines elements of all three factors into a comprehensive explanation. Climate stress may have already reduced and fragmented Neanderthal populations when Homo sapiens arrived, creating a perfect storm of pressures leading to their ultimate disappearance. This integrated model suggests Neanderthals faced multiple simultaneous challenges: adapting to rapidly changing environments, maintaining viable population sizes, and competing with a newly arrived human species. No single factor would have been fatal, but combined they proved insurmountable. The evidence increasingly points toward this multifactorial explanation. Neanderthals didn't simply lose to superior competitors. They faced a complex array of challenges that collectively led to their disappearance through a combination of extinction and absorption. What makes this question so compelling is its implications for ourselves. As we face our own unprecedented challenges, climate change, resource depletion, emerging diseases, the fate of our cognitively sophisticated cousins takes on new relevance. If a human species with minds like our own could disappear after hundreds of thousands of successful years, what does that suggest about our own future? The Neanderthal extinction becomes not just a historical puzzle, but a potential cautionary tale. Chapter 9. The New Science of Neanderthals. The past 2 decades have witnessed a revolution in our understanding of Neanderthals, driven by technological breakthroughs in several fields. Ancient DNA analysis, advanced imaging techniques, and sophisticated computer modeling have transformed the evidence available to researchers. Perhaps the most significant revolution came in ancient DNA recovery and analysis. When researchers first successfully extracted Neanderthal DNA in 1997, they could only recover small fragments of mitochondrial DNA. This offered limited insight into Neanderthal genetics. The breakthrough came in 2010 with the publication of the first draft Neanderthal genome, sequenced from bones found in Croatia's Vindija cave. This achievement, led by Svante Pjobo and his team, represented a quantum leap in our ability to compare Neanderthals with modern humans. The genomic evidence revealed something extraordinary. All non-African populations carry Neanderthal DNA, typically comprising 1 to 4% of their genome. This conclusively demonstrated interbreeding between our ancestors and Neanderthals, overturning decades of scientific consensus. Further genetic studies revealed which Neanderthal genes persist in modern populations. Some affect immune function, skin and hair characteristics, blood clotting, and even brain development. Far from being evolutionary deadweight, some Neanderthal genes provided adaptive advantages. This genetic legacy creates a fascinating paradox. Neanderthals simultaneously went extinct, yet live on within us. They disappeared as a distinct population, while portions of their genome continue to influence the biology of billions of people alive today. Advanced imaging technologies have similarly transformed our understanding of Neanderthal anatomy. CT scans allow researchers to examine the internal structures of fossils without damaging them, revealing details about brain shape, sinuses, ear structures, and development patterns. These imaging studies have debunked many anatomical myths about Neanderthals. They confirm they walked fully upright with posture identical to modern humans. Their brain structures, while differently shaped, show development of areas associated with language, social cognition, and planning. Virtual reconstructions based on these scans allow scientists to flesh out Neanderthals with unprecedented accuracy. Modern reconstructions bear little resemblance to the stooped, brutish creatures of earlier depictions, instead showing individuals who would indeed blend in on a modern subway. Microscopic analysis of Neanderthal teeth and bones has revealed detailed life histories of specific individuals. Growth patterns preserved in teeth work like tree rings, recording periods of stress or illness and allowing researchers to reconstruct childhood development in remarkable detail. These studies show Neanderthal children developed more rapidly than modern human children, reaching adulthood earlier. This faster maturation might reflect adaptation to harsh conditions, but would have provided less time for social learning, a potential disadvantage in changing environments. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal remains has transformed our understanding of their diets and movements. Different foods leave distinct chemical signatures in bones and teeth, allowing researchers to determine what individuals ate throughout their lives. These studies reveal Neanderthals weren't exclusively meat eaters as once thought. While animal protein dominated their diets, they also consumed significant plant foods, including grains, tubers, fruits, and nuts. Their diets varied considerably across regions and seasons. Strontium isotope analysis, which can determine where an individual lived at different life stages, shows some Neanderthals moved considerable distances during their lifetimes. This contradicts the image of Neanderthals as highly territorial with limited mobility. Computer modeling has allowed researchers to simulate Neanderthal capabilities in unprecedented ways. Models of their vocal tracts suggest they could produce most sounds found in human languages, though with slightly different resonance characteristics. Biomechanical models of their bodies demonstrate how their physique was optimized for power rather than endurance. Their stockier builds and shorter limbs provided mechanical advantages for close-range hunting techniques while conserving body heat in cold environments. These scientific advances have created a far more complex picture of Neanderthals than previously possible. But they've also revealed intriguing paradoxes that continue to challenge our understanding of these ancient relatives. One such paradox concerns their technological development. If Neanderthals possessed cognitive abilities comparable to Homo sapiens, why does their archaeological record show less technological variation and innovation over time? Why no clear evidence of bows, spear throwers, or bone needles? Several explanations have been proposed. Demographic factors likely played a key role. Neanderthals smaller, more scattered populations would have had fewer opportunities for innovation and cultural exchange compared to the larger, more connected Homo sapiens networks. Environmental factors may also explain the technological differences. Neanderthals' cold-adapted lifestyle required substantial calories just to maintain body temperature, potentially leaving less energy for activities beyond immediate survival compared to populations in warmer regions. The cultural conservatism once attributed to cognitive limitations might instead reflect adaptive stability. Their technologies were well suited to their lifestyle and environment, reducing pressure for radical innovation. Why fix what isn't broken? Another paradox concerns their disappearance itself. If Neanderthals possess minds essentially like our own, why couldn't they adapt to the challenges that ultimately led to their extinction? What advantage did Homo sapiens possess that allowed our survival when they perished? One possibility is that while Neanderthal cognitive capacities were similar to ours, subtle differences in social structure created significant advantages for Homo sapiens. Evidence suggests our ancestors maintained larger social networks with more extensive trade and information exchange. Archaeological sites show Homo sapiens routinely transported materials hundreds of kilometers from their sources, while Neanderthals typically used more local resources. This suggests our ancestors maintained longer-distance social connections, potentially offering greater resilience during crises. Language differences present another possibility. While Neanderthals likely possessed language, subtle differences in their vocal apparatus or neural language processing might have limited the efficiency of their communication compared to Homo sapiens. These communication differences might have created disadvantages in coordinating group activities, transmitting complex information, or maintaining social cohesion in larger groups, all factors that could prove decisive during environmental crises or competitive interactions. Perhaps the most intriguing paradox concerns the creative and symbolic expressions of Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. While evidence for Neanderthal symbolism exists, it appears less abundant and diverse than the explosion of art, ornaments, and ritual objects associated with early Homo sapiens. This disparity has multiple possible explanations. Preservation bias may play a role. If Neanderthals primarily created art on perishable materials like wood or hide, little would survive. Our picture might be skewed by what happens to preserve in archaeological contexts. Different environmental pressures might also explain the disparity. The harsh conditions Neanderthals faced might have left less time and energy for artistic expression compared to some Homo sapiens populations, especially those in resource-rich environments. Alternatively, while Neanderthals possessed the cognitive capacity for symbolism, they might have expressed it differently, perhaps through performance, storytelling, or other behaviors that leave minimal archaeological traces rather than permanent artistic creations. The newest research suggests another fascinating possibility. Neanderthal brains, while equal in capacity to ours, may have been wired differently. Their neural architecture may have created minds that were neither superior nor inferior to ours, but differently focused. CT scans suggest Neanderthals had larger visual systems, potentially giving them superior night vision and spatial processing, adaptations valuable for hunting in the forests of Ice Age Europe. Our ancestors, by contrast, may have devoted more neural resources to social processing. Chapter 10. The Human Family Reimagined. We've journeyed through centuries of misconceptions about our closest relatives and examined the evidence that has systematically dismantled the primitive Neanderthal stereotype. Now we arrive at the central revelation. Neanderthals were not a lesser form of humanity, but simply a different expression of it. The accumulated evidence points to a profound conclusion. Cognitive humanity, the capacity for language, symbolic thought, empathy, and cultural transmission is not unique to Homo sapiens. It evolved earlier in our lineage and manifested in at least two distinct human forms. This realization forces us to redraw our understanding of human evolution. Rather than a linear march of progress culminating in our species, we see a bush-like pattern with multiple branches. Different human forms adapted to different environments, but sharing fundamental cognitive capacities. For hundreds of thousands of years, while our ancestors developed in Africa, Neanderthals built their own societies across Europe and Western Asia. These were not primitive approximations of human culture, but fully realized expressions of human potential under different environmental conditions. When our ancestors finally expanded beyond Africa and encountered Neanderthals around 50,000 years ago, it wasn't a meeting between modern humans and primitive precursors. It was an encounter between two different kinds of human mind, each with its own history and adaptations. This encounter produced something remarkable: genetic exchange that continues in our bodies today. The Neanderthal contribution to our genome demonstrates that the boundaries between human forms were fluid. Their legacy didn't end with extinction, but continues within us. The revelation of Neanderthals as our cognitive peers raises profound questions about human identity. If the qualities we consider essentially human, language, art, technology, caring for the vulnerable, honoring the dead, existed in another human form, what truly defines humanity? Perhaps the answer lies not in any single anatomical feature or behavior, but in a constellation of cognitive capacities. The ability to imagine alternative futures, to create and manipulate symbols, to extend empathy beyond immediate kin, to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations. These capacities appear to have emerged gradually during human evolution, reaching full expression in both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, two different branches from the same cognitive root. Our uniqueness may lie not in these capacities themselves, but in how we express them. The differences between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens cultures likely reflect not cognitive inequality, but different adaptive paths. Their technologies, social structures, and symbolic expressions were shaped by specific environmental challenges and historical contingencies. Neanderthals developed bodies and technologies perfectly adapted to the cold, variable environments of Ice Age Europe. Their robust builds conserved heat. Their hunting techniques were optimized for close-quarter ambush, and their social structures maintained stability in harsh conditions. Our ancestors evolved in Africa's more varied environments, developing different adaptations, more heat-efficient bodies, technologies for diverse habitats, and possibly social structures that facilitated larger networks. Neither path was superior. Each represented successful adaptation to different conditions. When these two human forms met, they recognized enough similarity to interbreed, but maintained distinct identities for thousands of years of coexistence. This period represents a lost chapter in human history, a time when two kinds of human mind shared the European landscape. The ultimate disappearance of Neanderthals represents not the inevitable replacement of an inferior form by a superior one, but a complex historical outcome resulting from the interaction of environmental change, demographic factors, and competition between different but equally human populations. Had circumstances been slightly different, a less severe climate oscillation, a delay in Homo sapiens' expansion into Europe, a pandemic affecting our ancestors rather than Neanderthals, the outcome might have been reversed. Our existence is not the inevitable result of superior design. This revelation challenges deep-seated beliefs about human exceptionalism. The qualities we've long considered uniquely human, the supposed gulf separating us from all other life forms, were shared by another human species that walked the earth until geologically recent times. If we've been fundamentally wrong about our closest relatives for over a century, systematically underestimating their cognitive capacities and humanity, What does this suggest about our judgments regarding other forms of intelligence, both biological and potentially artificial? The Neanderthal revelation forces us to expand our conception of humanity beyond the specific biological form of Homo sapiens. Being human, in this broader sense, means possessing a particular kind of mind rather than a particular kind of body. This more inclusive definition of humanity has implications extending far beyond paleoanthropology. It suggests human-like consciousness may take different forms, whether in other species with large complex brains, in future human variations, or potentially in artificial intelligence. Recognizing Neanderthals as our cognitive equals requires acknowledging the contingency of our own existence. We are not the inevitable pinnacle of evolution, but one possible expression of human potential, the last surviving branch of a once more diverse human family. This realization can be both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it diminishes our claims to unique status. Liberating because it connects us to a broader human story. We are not alone in our humanity. We are heirs to multiple human lineages and potential futures. The Neanderthal in our DNA reminds us that human identity has always been fluid and hybrid. The boundaries we draw between human types, whether ancient or modern, reflect our categorizing minds more than biological reality. Humanity has always been diverse, always changing. Perhaps most profoundly, the Neanderthal revelation reminds us that different human forms can possess equal value and dignity despite physical differences. This historical lesson has obvious parallels to contemporary human diversity, a reminder that difference doesn't imply hierarchy. In correctly understanding Neanderthals, we also better understand ourselves. We are not the only expression of human potential that evolution has produced. We are the inheritors of multiple human lineages, carrying within our bodies the genetic legacy of different human forms. This perspective transforms how we might approach our future. If humanity has taken different forms in the past, might it take new forms in the future? As genetic technologies and human enhancement develop, the Neanderthal example reminds us that human variation has deep historical precedent. As we face unprecedented global challenges in the coming decades, the Neanderthal story offers both warning and inspiration. Warning in their ultimate disappearance. Inspiration in their remarkable resilience and adaptation over hundreds of thousands of years of climate fluctuation. The big revelation isn't simply that Neanderthals were our equals. It's that recognizing this fact fundamentally changes our understanding of what it means to be human. Humanity isn't a single species, but a cognitive space that has been occupied by different bodies and minds. This recognition doesn't diminish human uniqueness. The remarkable cognitive space we inhabit remains extraordinary in the history of life on Earth. But it suggests this space is more expansive and has been shared by more beings than we previously acknowledged. In correcting our understanding of Neanderthals, we glimpse a more accurate and profound vision of humanity itself, not as a single culminating species, but as a cognitive possibility that is manifested in different forms through time. We are not alone in being human. As our exploration of Neanderthals concludes, we're left with a transformed understanding, not just of these ancient relatives, but of ourselves. The primitive caveman stereotype has given way to recognition of sophisticated beings with minds fundamentally like our own. They were not failed experiments on the path to humanity, but successful expressions of human potential, thriving for hundreds of thousands of years in some of Earth's most challenging environments. Their story is not separate from ours, but interwoven with it. The Neanderthal within our DNA reminds us that human history is more complex and interconnected than we once believed. We carry their legacy in our immune responses, our skin, our tolerance for cold, a biological reminder of encounters between different human forms. This genetic heritage transforms how we must understand ourselves, not as the culmination of a single lineage, but as a mosaic of different human ancestries. Our genomes contain multitudes, including the echo of those we once considered fundamentally other. The revelation of Neanderthals as our cognitive equals challenges us to reconsider what we value about humanity. If the capacity for language, art, technology, and compassion extends beyond our specific species, what truly defines the human experience? Perhaps it's the capacity to ask this very question, to wonder about our place in nature, to seek meaning, to imagine alternatives to what exists. This capacity for self-reflection may be the shared legacy of the human mind, regardless of the specific body that houses it. As we continue exploring our origins and contemplating our future, the Neanderthal story reminds us to approach both with humility. Our existence wasn't inevitable, and our future isn't guaranteed. We are one expression of human potential in a universe of possibilities. In correctly understanding our ancient cousins, we better understand ourselves not as the only or inevitable form of humanity, but as the inheritors of a rich cognitive legacy that predates our species and continues to shape our potential futures. Subscribe for more journeys into humanity's deepest mysteries.